By thanking Mr. Gandhi and my boyhood friend Nasima Reddy. I looked at the list of people that have spoken to this group before, and understandably I'm somewhat petrified because of the list. It's so distinguished that I have some reservations about whether I can pull this off. So bear with me, and I hope I make it interesting. I'll begin by pointing out that when I was growing up in Hyderabad, I learned to speak before audiences like this. And one of the worst nightmares that I used to have was my father would show up as the chairman of the debating competitions that I would be speaking in. And some of the times when I would win first or second or whatever, he would, at the end of the debate, criticize the judges for awarding me the prize because I was so bad at what I said that he didn't think I deserved it. In a sense, I miss him, but I'm thankful that he's not here today. So what I will do is I'm going to hopefully take you on a journey that is completely different from anything you've ever heard, hopefully. And to start with, I will take you on the journey of what I believe explains most things that we are trying to understand, and that is evolution. Those of you who are otherwise oriented in terms of not believing in evolution, my apologies, but I must insist that that's what I will be using as a basis for trying to explain whatever it is that I have understood over the years. The best part of my life has been the 15 years that I spent with an organization called the Foundation for the Future, which was based in Bellevue, Washington. And the sole mission of the foundation was to increase and diffuse knowledge concerning the long-term future of humanity. And when we talk about the long-term future of humanity, I should point out that the focus was not 5 years, not 10 years, not 100 years, but millennia. In fact, I think that if we have to make an attempt to understand what is happening around us today, we have to take that perspective. So let me begin by pointing out that, oh, by the way, whatever I have to show by way of slides and all that are not mine. These are from scholars who have done the work. So at least, I will be not guilty of plagiarism or whatever. But the concepts and the ideas that I will present are conclusions that I have drawn based on the conversations with nearly 300 scholars over a 15-year period who were experts in multiple fields. That was one of the requirements of how we conducted affairs in the Foundation for the Future, was that it had to be multidisciplinary. So quite often we would get people who knew a lot about very little. And so when you brought them together, it helped in taking account of what they were saying in their respective disciplines, but then making sense as a totality. So let me begin by pointing out, this is done by Professor Eric Chasen, who's from Harvard, saying that we can recognize multiple stages of evolution, starting with the Big Bang, estimated to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 13.7 billion years ago, and going through multiple stages, particular, galactic, stellar, planetary, chemical, biological, and cultural. The other parts I know nothing about, but the cultural evolution part is what I'm going to be focusing on most of what I have to say today. What do we mean by cultural evolution? Professor Richard Dawkins, who is an evolutionary biologist at Oxford, coined the term meme, M-E-M-E, which runs parallel to the idea of the gene being the unit of biological evolution in terms of explaining how we have come to be where we are today as humans and a species. By the way, you probably already all know that the genetic makeup of humans and those of chimpanzees is identical, 98.4%. So the distinction between chimpanzees and humans is very small genetically, but the difference is tremendous, or as we say in the US, humongous. Anyway, so the word meme is the equivalent of the gene, and it represents an idea or a packet of ideas. And the whole idea of cultural evolution can be explained in terms of selection for fitness of memes as opposed to genes. So what happened about 10 years ago is the Royal Geological Society got together, and usually what they do specialize in is understanding tremendous geological phenomena on the planet and defining eras or eons. So I don't know the exact sequence, but you've heard of the Eocene, the Holocene, the Miocene, and all kinds of things. But about 10, 15 years ago, they decided that the next phase in terms of what they decided would be described as an era or an epoch is what they called the Anthropocene. Anthropocene meaning humans. And what they were trying to point out is that humans have altered the planet irreversibly, and so they deserve the dubious honor of assigning an eon or an era in honor of humans who made those irreversible changes to the planet. Now, what are these memes? I'm going to kind of concentrate on just a few of them that have dominated the planet over the last couple of millennia. I think you will recognize most of them. What I would say these constitute is what I will describe as the dominant paradigm, meaning we have operated within the framework of these memes over the last couple of millennia, 2,000 years at least. Okay, one of them falls in the category of what we might describe as religious memes. What are some of these memes that have kind of firmly taken hold in our consciousness, even though we don't really think about it too much? One is that humans represent divinity. Secondly, that humans are the apex of creation. Thirdly, that we are the primary agents when it comes to influencing matters on the planet, regardless of the environment within which we live and the factors that influence what happens on the planet besides our own interventions in it. To add to this, we have elevated the notion of human life to sanctity. Okay? So those are some of the religious memes that I'm sure you would all agree have become the background within which we function, followed by a set of memes that we can call or describe as falling in the realm of social, economic, political, cultural, and so on. What are these memes? Democracy, individualism, progress. Here I have a word or two to say about progress. What we have all come to understand, even today or yesterday it was, that I read in the newspapers and all over the TV, as a result of the demonetization that has occurred in India, that the GDP in India is going to be only 7.1%, as opposed to the fact that it used to be 9 or 8 or 10 or whatever it is. And we are really upset, in a sense, that it is falling, some of us anyway, and the fact that the Chinese have had some enormously higher rates of GDP growth. Now, I don't know how many of you are students of economics. Would you please raise your hand? Okay. I would like to ask the audience, could you please tell me how is GDP measured? Anybody? Beg your pardon?
Nobody knows. The three sectors.
Anybody? How is GDP measured? GDP is the sum total of all transactions in an economy where there is a monetary exchange. That is the important element when it comes to what GDP is. So, let me give you some examples. The freeways and highways here are clogged. So we are building more flyovers, multi-lane highways. The root cause is something else as to why this has happened. And we are spending all kinds of money in terms of meeting the requirements by way of supply when the demand has far exceeded by decades actually. In fact, whatever is happening in the cities that I observe now is 15, 20, 30 years behind what the capacity needed is today. Incidentally though, every single transaction involved in this is added to the GDP. Okay. Another aspect of GDP that you might consider is obesity, diabetes, heart disease is an and lung involved disease in India is an epidemic. So what are we doing? We build hospitals, there's a clinic every street corner, diagnostic centers, doctors by the hundreds of thousands. Crime is on the rise, not necessarily in India, but anywhere else in the world. So what do? We build police stations, we arm them, we create all kinds of support and safety systems for citizens. The point being, all of these are added to the GDP. But if that money was to be spent in a preventive sense, using that money in terms of opportunity cost, are these things a positive or a negative in a social, cultural sense? They are all negative, but they are all added to the GDP. In fact, a scholar in the UK, Professor Norman Myers, who has done a study of global GDP over the last 25 years. And basically what he did was, he said, for instance, I only mentioned 3 or 4 things. The Brazilian rainforests are being denuded on a daily basis by the thousands of acres, and I'll show you some slides as to what has happened in some of the areas of the planet where the forest cover and the rainforests are all disappearing like you haven't seen before. And all of the transactions involved in doing all those negative things to our environment is added to the global GDP. So what he did was, he said, let me do an exercise in subtracting what should be subtracted, because in an opportunity cost sense, those could be used in terms of some other objectives. And the net result he found was global GDPs had declined over a 25-year period. So progress, this is another notion that we have made part of our consciousness as a meme, and we are all committed to doing it without thinking twice about what it is that it actually means. And of course, one of the other memes that, I think for the better, is the fact that the scientific method came along, starting with Sir Francis Bacon and all other scientists. So a combination of scientism, combination of development and democracy is a set of memes that, believe it or not, every country in the world is trapped, and I'm using the word intentionally, trapped in. So this is what I call the dominant paradigm, insofar as the large set of objectives, large set of values, large set of what we have used unquestioningly in terms of determining where we are headed as a species. So now what I want to show you is some of the consequences of this dominant paradigm over the last 2 millennia. Can you please, before you consider the notion that in an individual sense, our sense of welfare participating in this system is measured by my per capita income, right? That's one of the measures that we use all over the world to say Bangladesh is at such and such level, India is at such and such level, the US is at such and such level. The per capita income in the US is somewhere in the neighborhood of $58,000. I'm not sure where India is, somewhere around the neighborhood of 8,000 or whatever. I don't know the exact number. Not important. But one of the well-known industrialist economists was touring Seattle and pointed out that by 2050, India's per capita income will be in the neighborhood of what the US is today. If you step back and think about that being utter nonsense, you would begin to understand that the rest of the world is not going to sit idly by while we are going at $50,000 per year. India's population may level, say at 1.6, 1.7, maybe 1.8. India, as I understood it last, grows at the rate of 1.7% per year, about 17 million to 20 million every year. Nobody talks about population anymore. It used to be a subject that was discussed before. But now think about this. The population of China, about a billion and a half. The population of India alone, about another 1.5 billion in the next 30 years. Total of 3 billion. And you multiply that by $50,000 a year. There's an organization in the United Kingdom called the Optimum Population Trust that has come up with calculations to point out that for that kind of an objective to be achieved, we will need 3 times all the known and unknown resources of the planet. That's one aspect of it. The second part of it is that a desirable objective? That's another question for philosophers to get into. Get to the next one. Alongside of the notion of population exploding like it has, there is an exact correlation to what is described as the consumption spike, which is exactly parallels what has happened since 1900, and basically we are talking about $40 trillion, but that's a very small number because subsequent to that it has gone up quite a bit higher. Alongside of this, the third one, this is the carbon dioxide spike, and I'll spend a little bit of time here because Ajay asked me if I would spend a little bit more time on climate change and what this hullabaloo is all about. Because in the US, the most advanced economy in the world, a majority, I don't know if it's a majority, but significant percentage of the population deny that there is such a thing as climate change happening. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere 1900 was 290 parts per million. Later on in the evening, if we have time, I'll show you a 10-minute interview by an expert on climate change that talks about the fact that we will most likely be around 500 parts per million. Right now it's about 390. We'll be at 500 parts per million in the next 30 years, if not sooner. Now, what does that mean? It means that the greenhouse gases are going to get trapped even more. The planet is going to get hotter and hotter. But that's not the only thing. There is a scientist in Chicago, Professor Archer. You can look up his work. One of the things that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which, by the way, is a political organization, it has nothing to do with the science of climate change. They get together every so often and continuously moderate the importance of what is happening to lower and lower thresholds that is acceptable to everybody. You have heard the debate constantly saying, well, you created all the pollution and all of the rise in the carbon dioxide on the planet. Why should we now stop because our people need to be progressing also along the notion of GDP and per capita income and all that? I equate that to the notion of वो कुएं में गिरा है, हम भी जाके गिरेंगे. So, So that's what has happened to the carbon dioxide spike. But the point I wanted to make about carbon dioxide is the fact that the half-life of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as determined or published by the IPCC, is said to be in the neighborhood of 14 years, meaning there is a wash, which would be wonderful if that was the case. But now scientists are establishing the fact that the half-life of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 200 years, or maybe even 300-400 years, meaning carbon dioxide in the atmosphere put in the industrial age is still there. And so this gentleman who does a lot of work on climate change, his name is Dr. David Wasdell, and hopefully I'll have a chance to show you that. He points out that we are on the verge of runaway climate change, meaning we may have gone past the stage of reversibility of climate change that is already afoot. And that is because not only is carbon dioxide a factor, but the Arctic permafrost, the ice cover in the Arctic is disappearing, releasing methane by the millions of tons per day. That is an addition to the carbon dioxide, far more dangerous. And not only that, we are reducing the capacity of the ocean in terms of being a carbon sink by eliminating the plankton that is part of the absorbing mechanism of the ocean. The rainforests are disappearing, and let me show you some. But meanwhile, so much for climate change. You know, you can do much more work on it, but let me show you the other two. Go ahead, next one. This is something that I'm sure Urmila here would relate to. She is an ardent, passionate environmentalist and person who cares about this. Professor Wilson of Harvard, one of the most renowned sociobiologists on the planet, has estimated, let me begin by pointing out that there are literally tens of millions of species still on the planet, but we are losing them at the rate of 20 to 25,000 species per year. Now, it may not seem like much, but this is a case of imagining a metaphor of a house of cards, where you remove a card, it doesn't make much difference. You remove another card, the structure still stands but begins to wobble. At some point in time, you remove a card and the whole system collapses. There is some fear that we are on the path to creating that kind of a set of circumstances. Now, so I talked about the carbon dioxide spike, the population spike, the consumption spike, and the carbon dioxide spike. Okay, in the 70s, a scientist and her colleague did a famous study called Limits to Growth. Donella Meadows. And so what some scientists have done recently is to say, how accurate were they? They predicted some 30, 40 years ago that there are limits to growth. How accurate were they? So what they did was they plotted things that they had predicted 30 years ago to see what the current trends are. The solid lines on the dotted lines represent the current state of affairs as compared to the predictions of 30, 40 years. Okay. And finally, one more. This is another one that has to deal with the stock of resources on the planet, and depending on or based on current levels of consumption, which is actually an exponent, not some linear thing, they are estimating the life of some of the most important resources. I won't go into a lot of details, but they range from anywhere between 10 to 12 years to 80. The single most important one, of course, I'm sure you've all read about it, is fossil fuels. When I talk to sixth graders, the question I ask is, can you name me a single input to the planet other than the sun? External input, none. So, the point is, everything that exists on the planet has been there. You are not adding to its stock, but you are subtracting on an exponential basis. So let's estimate, this is the way I put it, Let's say that we are wrong by 50 years. Let's say we are wrong by 100 years to any one of these things. It is a foregone, undebatable conclusion that you're going to run out of everything if we continue on the current path. Okay. Now the last couple of things that I want to talk about is what is it that we base all this on, is that humans are the primary drivers insofar as creating a set of objectives or a vision as to what the future should be, and then thinking that it is entirely within our control to bring it about. Isn't that the case? When you have a 7-year plan for some economy or a strategic plan for a business or whatever it is. But let me kind of complicate the issue a little bit so that we can expand the notion of what that means and try to understand it a little bit better. Visualize, if you will please, a 3-dimensional matrix. Okay? On the x-axis, by the way, I was terrible at mathematics, but this part I've been able to understand. The x-axis, individual, humans, operating in multiple identities, as an individual, as a member of a family, as a member of a neighborhood, and on and on and on, including the nation state, on the one axis. The second axis is the environment within which we function as humans. The biosphere, the geosphere, the atmosphere, space, the zoosphere, that would be the second axis. Some 3, 4, 5 different variables. And to complicate things, the Z, we call it Z, you can call it Z. The Z axis is the multitude of social, cultural, political, economic, and religious systems that we have created and operate in. Would you so far agree? Right? Okay. So in terms of thinking about something happening, you must visualize the fact that this is a complex interaction of multiple variables simultaneously acting on each other at all times. Right? So to think that we are in charge and can make things happen based on our vision of what seems to be our objective is a nonsensical notion. How does the future actually emerge? Because those are words that I'm using very carefully. Future is not something we create based on our design. I will submit to you that the future is an emergence. It is something that happens as a result of the complex interaction, but I will grant you this. Individuals are extremely important players. And one scientist, in terms of statistical terminology or jargon, calls it, we are active walkers. So I'll give you a small thought experiment in terms of trying to explain what emergence is. Visualize a flat surface. This I'm borrowing from a scientist by the name of Herr Bach, who has written a book called How Nature Works. So the metaphor or the analogy he uses is, imagine a flat surface, humans as individual inputs. The flat surface is the planet. It's a stretch. The planet is not a flat surface, but for the sake of this experiment, thought experiment. Individuals by the billions are grains of sand that are inputs to the system within the context that I just described, interacting simultaneously with all the variables that are operating at all times. And they are doing so in these billions of locations at different rates, in different quantities, which is analogous to what we are actually doing. So what would happen as a natural outcome? You will have pockets of sand piles, correct? Depending on whatever is happening locally. After a certain amount of time, neighboring piles will coalesce and collapse into a single pile. And this now happens simultaneously all over the flat surface. And eventually, what's the outcome? If we were to aggregate this over long periods of time, the entire pile would collapse into a single pile. So, what's the conclusion out of this? We all had inputs to the system, but the outcome was a natural result, a consequence of the multitudes, millions, billions of interactions that are going on an ongoing basis. So in that sense, there are 2 or 3 other ideas that we need to keep in mind, and I would, if you're not already exposed to it, please take some time. I think one of them is the notion of tipping points. Malcolm Gladwell has written some very interesting has done some very interesting work on tipping points, meaning exactly what I was describing as it relates to sand pile, where an aggregation of circumstances and inputs to a system creates a tipping point where the system is no longer what it used to be. Okay? And then the second aspect is what I would say is critical mass. Critical mass again is the notion where, as I was saying earlier, single piles achieve a certain mass that becomes critical to where it no longer is an additive process adding to that pile but collapses into something else. So in order to understand and maybe think more rationally about how the future happens, you have to think in terms of the future as emergence. Now, what kind of a lesson does that have to tell us by way of managing our own future? The first thing we have to take into account is that it is not a top-down process. It has to be a bottom-up process. Bottom-up in the sense that the quality, the timeliness, the value of the input by way of the individual grains of sand has to be in terms of coherently pointed towards an objective that we all agree on, rather than operating in a chaotic circumstances with multiple variables interacting. So the notion of the future as an emergence, these important concepts, critical mass, tipping points, emergence, are all very important to understand. So given all this, what I would say is that we need to think in terms of a few transitions that are taking place in the planet and what might be the makings of a new paradigm if we are going to survive as a species. Because the same gentleman, David Wasdell, is a little bit of an alarmist, but he points out that we could very well be on the verge of the 6th great extinction. By the way, it's important to note that in the evolutionary process, we might think that we have been around forever. We have not been around forever. In terms of a 24-hour clock, somebody has estimated that modern humans represent a split second before midnight on a 24-hour clock. The second thing to think about is 99.9% of all that ever existed is extinct, and we are not exempt. But we have come up with some ideas in terms of making sure the species survives. So the notion of migrating to space, colonizing moon, making habitats on Mars, these are all attempts for those that can afford it to escape this mess and go live somewhere else. There are people talking about inhabiting asteroids that are surrounding the planet and so on. So there are many kinds of ideas. One of the things that I get by way of objection when I talk about all this is to say technology will solve everything. When we are running out of resources, substitutes will occur, and technology will solve all these problems. And I basically say, up to a point I would agree, but let me give you some examples of why technology is not the answer. And I point out, in India, for instance, the bicycle was invented some 300 years ago. What percentage of the population in India today has bicycles? A small minority. and on, whether it's a television set or a pressure cooker. All these are technological innovations that we have learned to consume. But smaller and smaller numbers of people actually have the ability to obtain them, let alone something new that comes along. So when you create a substitute or an alternative technology, you have not only not satisfied existing demand, but you have created demand for something new, which again uses the same materials that we just pointed out, have a limited lifespan or half-life. The second thing is, technology creates complications. Complications in the sense that, for instance, I think last year and this year, on 1 week, in 1 week in China, there was a 90-mile-long traffic jam because of climate conditions and an accident somewhere. That is technology creating that outcome. If you visualize in Hyderabad, one accident on one of the major roads, you're finished for 3 hours. So technological innovation creates a complexity where it's as good as the weakest link. And anything that happens to the weakest link, it creates bigger problems. Additionally, for instance, in New York, as another example, one capacitor somewhere, whatever the transformer, blowing up, shut down the entire east coast of the United States because the grid is totally connected all across the entire east coast. So the point I'm making is, technology may offer short-term solutions, but it's not an answer. Now, let me finish by pointing out some of the important transitions that are happening. One, I am going to make the statement that the nation state is obsolete, even though we are committed in terms of our identities to not being able to go beyond that. And the reason why I argue that is to say, name me a single challenge, a single problem that a nation state can solve by itself today. I will challenge you to name one. I'm not talking about cleaning up the neighborhoods, Swachh Bharat or whatever, but I'm talking about poverty, talking about pandemics, talking about nuclear weapons, I'm talking about trade agreements. The fact is, if you carefully think about it, every supranational entity that has arisen as a reaction to the fact that the nation state is inadequate to dealing with the multiple trade agreements, the multiple security arrangements, the European Union is a classic example of where the notion of the nation state has been superseded, even though now, because of reactionary forces, they are trying to withdraw and go back into the shell, just like what the US did in November, electing a president who wants to go back into the shell. But globalization, this is something else that people talk about, is something that globalization happened the last 20 years. But I would submit to you that globalization started when humans left Africa 200,000 years ago. Marco Polo was a globalizer. Attila the Hun was a globalizer. Genghis Khan was a globalizer, and on and on and on and on. The second transition that I see happening, as far as I'm able to observe, is what I will call this individualism versus the collectivism movement, where we have now elevated the notion of individualism to a pinnacle where you cannot challenge it no matter what. In terms of physics, what I equate the two, individualism is a centrifugality in a societal context. Centrifugality in the sense that it pulls away from the center, radiates out of the center. Center being what you might describe as the collective aspect of a social context. Collectivism, on the other hand, is a centripetality, meaning it draws towards the center. I submit to you that centripetality is being overrun by the notion of individualism to the detriment of the system itself. We can argue this. It's kind of a position that is conceptual because there's no way to quantify it except to intuitively sense it in terms of, for instance, the nuclear family breaking up, the joint family gone. In the US, for instance, another way to look at it is there's a lawyer for every 300 people. Why do we have a lawyer for every 300 people? Because individuals don't talk to each other anymore. They mediate through a lawyer. I have lived on the same street for 35 years and I don't know my neighbors. It's a fact. Except, of course, if there was an emergency or if I needed somebody desperately, they might poke their noses out of their homes and say, "Can I help you?" So this...
The threat of being shot.
Beg your pardon?
The threat of being shot for trespass.
Exactly. Because now, they have new laws where self-defense mandates that you can shoot somebody that harmlessly enters your front door. Now, the third transition, again, in the big picture sense, is if you look at over long periods of time, I think knowledge-based systems are overpowering faith-based systems. Another way to look at it is, I will posit the statement, we know a little bit more about everything around us than we did yesterday. We knew a little bit more about us yesterday than we did the day before, by way of established facts, scientific method, and so on. Even as I say all that, I will myself point out or say that we'll never know as a complete, utter finality as to where it all started. Is it cyclical, universal, cyclical universes, or is it a linear and all that? We don't need to go into all that. But the fact of the matter is, faith-based systems are being overcome by knowledge-based systems. And the reason I point that out, I think it's important in the sense that if you want to understand what is happening in terms of what we might describe as terror or fundamentalism, these are reactions to the loss of power, influence, and control by these groups in terms of the hold they had on large numbers of people. So they are desperately trying to fight the idea of losing control. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. I think all this is a passing phenomenon, but not in the next 5, not 10, whatever, but in the long term. So I'll finish by pointing out that the new paradigm is beautifully articulated by Sir James Lovelock. He has written a book called Gaia. Gaia literally means mother goddess. And it's a description of the planet as a earth system where the multiple variables that interact with each other in terms of the temperature, in terms of the levels of oxygen and nitrogen, and the way the ocean performs, and humans as participants, is a fine-tuned mechanism. And any disruption to any one of these variables will throw the system out of kilter. Incidentally, what does our own philosophy, ancient philosophy, say about who we are and where we belong as part of this overall system? Okay. So Gaia is one of those things. To think in terms of individuals not as the apex of creation, but as part and parcel of a completely interdependent system where we are not the masters, but co-equal participants. Even though other things may seem lifeless, they have capacities to influence us like we don't have any idea of. Take a tsunami or a cyclone or a hurricane or an earthquake or a thunder or a lightning strike, then we suddenly understand that we are not in charge. And the second thing is, keeping with what I have said so far, we have to think in terms of planetary citizenship. What does that mean? Again, a thought experiment. So far, the way we have looked at things is, we are on the verge of exhausting resources. We are on the verge of all kinds of issues by way of consumption, climate change, and all these things. But a thought experiment. So far, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, NATO, the Security Council, these are all people floundering to determine what is a desirable set of circumstances going forward. But a thought experiment, again, if you will. What would happen if tomorrow we have confirmed that there is a hostile alien threat? What do you think would happen? We would forget all our differences and go and fight that common threat.
We just had demonetization.
Beg your pardon?
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Back to the barter system,
So-
it's already resolved.
So the point is, we as individuals have the capacity to assume identities that are at higher and higher and higher levels. A simple example, your children play a game, right? Your neighborhood selects a high school cricket team, another neighborhood has a high school cricket team. They fight to the death with parents cheering and screaming at the umpire on the sideline for bad calls. But now if they have to come together and create a team out of those two teams to fight some other neighborhood, these very same parents are now shouting at the other team while they have come together in a warm embrace. I think if you kind of extend that notion, we are capable of that identity, and I will submit to you that unless and until we do that in short order, there are not just me, but scientists of considerable repute. One is Michio Kaku of New York University, who has written several books. One of them is called Vision. He basically says we have a 30-year period to get our act together. Otherwise, we may have to call it quits. Thank you. Describing borders on conspiracy theories. And I'm not sure that I am prepared to subscribe to the deliberate planning and execution of things that would eliminate large parts of the population. I don't think we need conspiracy theories to do all that. We are doing a fine job even otherwise. Describe what we are doing as civilized. It's a classic case where, this comes up often. If you think about it, some of the most profound ideas and technologies were innovated in Eastern civilizations. And not just ideas, but technologies. For instance, China invented gunpowder. China invented the compass. China was a pioneer in manufacturing paper and all kinds of other stuff. But for the longest time, China never went beyond its borders. If anything, they built a wall to prevent outsiders from coming in. Similarly, if you go back to the roots of Indian civilization, some of the greatest ideas came from our civilization. The motivation was knowledge for knowledge's sake, not knowledge to apply and exploit and use everything around us. That's the fundamental difference. But now, unfortunately, we are now on the path of doing exactly what the rest of the world has been doing, to say, how can we apply knowledge in terms of being serving or servitude to progress, as I just described, in terms of what we understand progress to mean.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture, sir. I'm here. Sir, I just...
I hope I made you think. I'm not saying I'm right, I'm not saying I'm wrong. Just want you to think. If you are interested, I'll wait for your question. I can give you a list of about 30 or 40 books that will change the way you think about things. One of them, by the way, is written by a gentleman who now lives in Ooty, in Kunur, who used to be in the movie industry, but has written a fabulous little book called The Third Curve. And the Third Curve, C-U-R-V-E. And his name is Mansoor Khan. Get a copy of it. Two or three things that I will say in response. I have spent a lot of time in 6th grade classrooms. Children, they understand what I have said better than most adults. The second thing I would say is what we are discussing and thinking about is in terms of people sitting in this arena here. It may not be possible because we are too deeply entrenched in the current, you can call it the operating system or the paradigm. So I think this is a generational transformation that needs to happen. Maybe, and this brings me to the one aspect that I want to point out. I described the elements of what is constituted, which is the final stage of evolution. This same scientist describes it as ethical evolution. Ethical evolution in terms of thinking about what is it that we are doing to the future generations by our actions today. For all intents and purposes, we are leaving them nothing. If we are concerned about our children and our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren, maybe that will appeal to our better senses to act differently. But the most important thing is, and this is where I can say I'm pessimistic, where in the same classrooms, children, if they are confronted with ideas and facts and things, they readily understand. But the baggage they bring to the classroom by virtue of the brainwashing of the parents is something is going to be very difficult to separate. So I don't, on a daily basis, whether it's in the villages or in the cities or on the streets, carrying these huge bags on their back. And what are they being taught? They are being not taught how to think, but what to think. And so that they can pass some test. And then I have gone to MBA classes, and one of the first questions I ask is, what's your objective? Well, I want to join a corporation and get a big salary. They don't have the faintest idea of what's going on around them, and they don't care, they're not interested. So they have been trapped in a system where I don't know what the outcome, how you get them out of it. Except, this is again, one of those students says, what can I do? I say, change one person. It'll take forever, but better than carrying on as usual. I think that's a very good question, but I'll answer it slightly differently. I agree with you to where this self-indulgence, this constant selfie is a perfect example of what modern technology by way of all this represents. But think about this. You know, in our ancient philosophies, we start with the supposition that there was consciousness to begin with, and we are all manifestations of that consciousness. But think for a minute about the fact that today the technology exists for any individual anywhere on the planet to talk to another individual on the planet at the speed of light. So, as you actually observe now, more and more of organizing on a bottom-up basis is happening. You extend that notion to where you are thinking about a global brain. Actually, a friend of mine has written a book called The Global Brain. Meaning, it is possible that this notion of consciousness not as a pre-existing condition, but as a condition that we have the potential to arrive at by virtue of the integration of technology and individuals coming together and think in a global sense. So there are some examples where two individuals organized and got people together to ban mines, landmines. And more of that kind of activity is possible. And I think, again, if you were to subscribe to the idea of evolution, this is something else that I would maintain, is that we as humans are not all that great about anticipating, planning, and arriving at futures, but we are very good at reacting when things go to hell. And we may be on the verge where it might arouse global populations to do something about it. Like, for instance, in the Middle East, you are seeing uprisings bottom up, where they have been held under systems that they have been subject to for centuries.
Your question.
Hello, sir. So I have a two-part question. So I think Professor Iman Healy from some university in Austin, Texas, talks about this. There's been a shortening of evolutionary time scale if you look at it. So the first hominid first came up some few million years ago, and then the Neanderthals some 500,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago. So it's shortening, and so even in technological terms and not organic terms, that agricultural revolution happened some 10,000 years ago, and then the scientific revolution 450 years ago, and then the industrial revolution. So in this sense, could we say that the next stage of evolution is just around the corner? So this is the first part of the question, and if it is, and considering there are a lot of human enhancement technologies which are currently being developed, and I'm not familiar with all those projects, so can we assume that if evolution is around the corner, will this evolution mark a shift from natural selection to intelligent design?
Oh boy. Well, I'm not someone who would subscribe to intelligent design. As a matter of fact, I think that is a classic case of everything is perfect. Therefore, there must be a perfect cause, and that perfect cause is some super intelligence.
Brilliantly put.
Beg your pardon?
Brilliantly put, I say.
Yeah. So, and by the way, the Institute for Intelligent Design is based in Seattle. It's called Discovery Institute. And they create all these mathematical explanations for the fact that evolution as we understand it to be is statistically, probabilistically speaking, impossible. But insofar as what you said, as I just mentioned, that we are very good at reacting. If we can come together and collectively react, yes, but there are one or two caveats. This gentleman, the scientist that I was hoping to show you a video about, and my own colleague used to describe the condition insofar as where we are at today. He would say that human beings as a species are in a vehicle going down a steep slope without brakes, without steering, and without headlights. And things changing around us so fast that the capacity to see is not there because things are moving faster than our ability to see. The simple fact of the matter is, no matter how sophisticated and civilized we might think we are not very different from humans 200,000 years ago. You use the term Homo sapien to describe humans as of today. I would argue about the sapien part.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. Extremely enlightening. Lapped up every word of it. I have my question is regarding this entire idea of our movement and our shift from a faith-based system to a knowledge-based system, where I find part of it is desirable and part of it I am questioning, and that is what I want to share with you and want to know your views.
Yes.
When we say faith-based system, I see it in two parts. One is an organized religion-based system which is creating the problems like terrorism and all, or right-wing nationalism that we see today. The other, when I say faith-based, I look at it as spirituality. Yes. Return to a value-based thinking. Return to, say, the core philosophy that, say, for example, Hindu religion talks, or say Gandhian philosophy talks about, right, which is desirable.
Yes.
So when we are moving towards a knowledge-based system, which is about acquiring, owning, accumulating, and just increasing our consumption of things, and there is a part of this faith-based value system which is desirable. to infuse that into the knowledge, to return to the basics and return to a simpler, more, basic way of thinking, where we stop playing God and we sort of look at ourselves as merely one of the species which inhabit the planet, but are doing so much more than our share of harm to it, and causing extinction possibly of the entire planet. So in terms of how to go about it, my question is coming from there. How do you think, or what would you propose? How do we strike that balance between faith-based system which is desirable versus that which is not desirable?
Yeah, and I completely agree with the distinction you make between faith-based systems a la organized religion versus spirituality. Insofar as an answer to the question, I think the closest that I come to subscribing or agreeing with is the Buddhist notion of ethics and behavior, as opposed to some other system which is divinity based or God created or whatever, because it immediately eliminates the challenge or the controversy about is there a God, is there not a God, or whatever. The second part of it, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but most of the time what we tend to do is think about symptoms rather than examining what I describe as multiple levels of causes. Okay? What you observe is climate change today, if we agree with it or not. For the moment, let's assume that's the case. Now, what we are tending to do is to attack the notion of climate change by virtue of saying there are two alternative strategies. One is mitigation, meaning stop the flow of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, or the other one is adaptation, which is let's move people away from ocean shores to higher ground so that when the oceans get higher and higher due to climate change, we have adapted to the notion that people have moved away. But those are things that attack the notion of climate change as a symptom. So what is the root cause?
Yeah, prevention.
So one of the things that people, I believe, one of the things that needs to happen in education, I think that is the key, is to explain the notion of what constitutes critical thinking.
Yes.
What are the elements of critical thinking? One, if you observe a symptom, the first level is the immediate cause. The second level is the proximate cause. The third level is the intermediate cause. And finally, you get to the root cause. So one of the things that we can teach ourselves and our children is to keep asking why or how. Because eventually you pursue this, you get to the point where the solution is obvious to the symptom that you are attempting to correct at the superficial level. The second thing that needs to happen is when it comes to thinking, people don't realize the errors we make, including myself, I'm doing it all the time, is there are four kinds of errors in how we think. One, insufficient information. Okay. I'll give you an example. I hope we've got the time. Can we?
No. For insufficient information, we have enormous time.
Good sense of humor. He's saying that everything I have given so far is insufficient. No. Anyway, so insufficient information. Let's say that I make a statement. The average height of human beings on the planet is 5'6". As a number, 5'6" represents the average. But in terms of understanding heights of human population on the planet, it's completely useless.
Yeah. Inadequate.
It's completely insufficient. You need to know not only the average, but what is the standard deviation around that average of human population? How many deviations on the left represents 4 feet 7 inches, and on the other hand, basketball players at 7 foot 2 inches? Then you say the first deviation around the average constitutes 65% of the population, the second deviation 85%, the third deviation 96%. Now you know a lot more about human population. The second error in thinking is simply erroneous, factual errors. But we take it for granted and then proceed to make statements about it. For the longest time, the greatest minds that preceded us several millennia ago thought that the earth was flat. Right? Well, now we know it's wrong. So, erroneous information is as deadly as insufficient information. The third error in thinking is the implicit bias that we bring to anything that is being discussed. Bias in the sense that it's called what is called confirmation bias. We look to see what confirms what we already believe, and the rest is ignored, even though the facts are staring in your face as a contradiction to what you hold so dearly. And the final and the most deadly error is prejudice. So when we are talking about education, it helps all of us and children especially to say, teach them how to think, to be able to identify what is insufficient, what is an error, examine their own biases, or somebody telling them something, and have the courage to challenge and say, how did you come to that conclusion? What are the facts? What are the biases that are explicit or implicit in what you're saying? Those would be the beginnings of going to answering whether, elements of faith are important, or, as I say, if you were to proceed from observing something external and keep asking those questions, you're going to get to something that might amount to an article of faith or belief, which follows logically in terms of what you observed as an externality.
Right. You sort of, in a way, marry the
in
two.
In a way, it gets to that.
Yeah.
But not simply start with that proposition and then ignore everything else.
Sir, I was
Thank you.
at this juncture. Thank you for one reason. The show is not over, but I just want to thank you because when we started Manthan, and for the past 11 years we are conducting these conversations. One of the reasons why we are conducting these conversations is to eliminate this aspect of bias and eliminate this idea of prejudice in our minds when we enter a conversation. And I'm very glad that when you put it so succinctly, and this is why only good thinkers like you can put a complex problem in such easy sentences. And I want to thank you for that, because this is one of the reasons why we are conducting these conversations for the last 11 years. I just want to thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed every minute of it. Almost every time we have had these conversations about the long-term future, no matter what the subject, two things come up. Even if the system or the systemic issue is a technological one or a technical one, 9 times out of 10, the conclusion is that the solution is about human beings and not the technical issue, insofar as how they collaborate, how they come together, how they get together, address the problem, understand the problem, and solve it. The second one that always comes up is the word education. Not education meaning getting an engineering degree, or all those things are important, but education in terms of what is it that we really need to know. I don't know if I answered you right. You said it was. Now, why is this important? Take a look at. This is 1973.
Ramon, light off.
And this is February 2006, Las Vegas. Now, why is that important? What do you see that is obvious? If you know anything about Las Vegas.
There are more gamblers than ever before.
That's another way to put it, but that's the symptom.
There's
Actually, Las Vegas is nothing but arid desert. And now, that is Las Vegas, artificially green. Actual grass. And the reason for that is, all of the water that is coming to Las Vegas, this area is in severe water shortage. It's in drought. It's in water shortage. There is an underground aquifer in the Midwestern states in the United States called Ocala. They are draining that aquifer to make this happen. An aquifer, this is something an Indian scientist taught me when I held a conference on water as a global crisis, is the fact that the annual amount of fresh water supplied to the planet is a constant by virtue of the climate system. It's a constant. It never changes. It may vary from place to place. So when we are using water in excess of the natural supply, you are draining aquifers that have been existing for millennia, for tens of thousands of years. A. B. Some concrete examples. I'm sure this is the case in Hyderabad. I found this out to be the case for sure in Bangalore. 30 years ago, you dug a bore well in Bangalore, you found water at 150 feet. Today, you cannot find water at 1500 feet. So, let's keep going. I can go on and on about water quite a bit. This is Bolivia, 1975. Now, next. 25 years later. Next. This is Argentina. Go ahead.
Just a second, please. Have they created a water body?
Beg your pardon?
Okay, if you could please go back to the previous slide, please.
That is all green.
No,
The previous one.
I see a water body in 2003, which I don't see in 1973.
Yes, 1973, 2003. That might be a natural man-made
Dam.
or something.
Okay.
But you can see urbanization
Yes,
and
yes,
the result.
yes.
This is one of the largest freshwater lakes on the planet in 1976. Only the next slide. Gone.
Oh God.
That's Dhaka,
Yes.
Bangladesh. That's Dhaka, population 21.5 million. This is Santiago, Chile, one of the biggest mining countries in the world. Go ahead.
And we are talking of only 25 years.
Yes. And by the way, what is more important to observe is the pace at which we are doing what we are seeing on the right side is now exponentially faster. I would suspect that if you had space shots of different places over India, you will see the same thing. Anyway, those are the slides I wanted to show.
Thank you.